Hello class, this is Serena. I'm going to talk to you today about concepts, what are social science concepts, and the importance of concepts in conducting research. I actually spend an entire semester talking about concepts, but we're going to talk about concepts in only a few lectures in this particular class. So we need to train ourselves in handling concepts to achieve clarity in thinking and accuracy in our observations. So concepts are supposed to represent something that we study. So we map the world, we see the world, we interpret the world through concepts, especially in social science research. So I'll get into what exactly concepts are, but when we conduct research, when we write our literature reviews, everything hangs on those particular concepts. So the better the concepts, the better our knowledge. So research concepts, just kind of look at it as units of thinking. So research concepts direct our observations and analysis. So if we think of concepts such as what do we mean when we study patriotism or participation, or what does the word prejudice mean? So these are our building blocks of our theory. So media use is a concept. Social media use is a concept. So let's say as a researcher, you want to analyze to what extent people use social media, or what we refer to as social media use. So is use when somebody opens up an application? Do we consider that use? Is use something that we measure as logging on to what types of social media accounts every day? Do we consider closed messaging apps social media? So it's basically working on precision and how we interpret these things that are not always directly observable. So a concept is only significant when it occurs in a relationship together with other concepts. Concepts only have meaning because scientists assign meaning to them. So we say this word anxiety exists. We say this word happiness exists. But we need to be able to say, first of all, it does exist. How do we define it? And then how do we measure it? So it's a lens through which our data are analyzed. And so and concepts are really, really important. Things such as agenda setting, public opinion, mass communication, social media. These are all things, again, we say that exist. And so when we do research or we look for research, we have to basically look for concepts rather than topics. So what is theory? So if you go into a PhD program or a master's program that emphasizes research, essentially what you're trying to do is produce what is called theory. So a theory is essentially saying this concept relates to this concept. So we could say something like, let's see, education, one's education will correlate with one's expertise. We could say that mobile phone ownership relates to social media use. So what we see there is two concepts. So as a researcher, what you do is you look for concepts and then you try to identify or look for concepts that predict variations in another concept. It's somewhat confusing and it's kind of difficult to wrap your mind around, but just understand that's how we see the world. When I look at something, I try to map the world through concepts. So it's basically just focusing on creating concepts to build and test theory. So what is theory? That is the definition of theory. It's not, what happens oftentimes is, oh, there's agenda setting theory, there's framing theory, there's social cognitive theory, and that's how students tend to interpret what is theory. But at its most basic level, a theory is just the relationship between two or more concepts. Okay, so that's what theory essentially is, and that's the foundation of it. So what is science? So the idea is that we are researchers, we're scholars who want to produce science or scientific knowledge. So scientific knowledge, now think about this, is a collection of abstract theoretical statements. So our knowledge, what we say is knowledge, how do we know what we know, is based on concepts and relating all these concepts to one another. So that is what is considered knowledge. Theories reflect what we know. However, most theories are not directly observable. So what we need to do is figure out how to systematize observations in order to map and create these concepts. It's really, really important to understand what a concept is, but basically a concept is the foundation for scientific knowledge. And so what you're trying to do in this class is more about methods, but it's really important that when you look for research that you understand kind of the meaning of what a concept is. Okay, so concept questions. So when you are thinking about concepts or thinking about concepts for your research, or if you're wanting to do you have to do a story about a particular topic, oftentimes it's best to know what concepts are associated with that topic in order to learn more about that topic. So some exercises that students in my classes often do is they'll think of a topic and then they'll think of concepts related to that particular topic. So for instance, one of my students right now is working on a project where she wants to learn about how students use a closed messaging app for news. And so she needs to look at concepts associated with that topic. So it might be news media use, it might be social media use, it might be I think she wants to look at, so not WeChat, maybe WeChat, but essentially she just needs to think about all the concepts that could be associated with that particular topic. And then she looks at age and experience and anything that could be related to that topic. And then you want to figure out kind of what the different conceptual meanings are assigned to each term. So a very popular topic in these research method classes is engagement, social media engagement. So what does social media engagement look like? Is it liking a post? Is it hearting a post? Is it commenting on a post? Is it commenting once a day within a social media platform? Is it sharing news with somebody else? And so we have to define, first of all, what do we mean by the word engagement? And then how do we measure engagement? And so conceptual definitions are more like dictionary type definitions, like how do we define the term? And operational definitions are how do we measure that term? So what are the different ways that we're going to measure something like depression? So how do we measure depression? We don't just look at somebody and see whether they're depressed. We ask them a series of questions that look at, you know, whether that person is depressed and to what extent that person is depressed based on self-report measures. And then you'll find that there's often different labels for concepts that are similar in meaning, and I'll get into that a little bit. And then you just kind of have to select which is the most promising label for your research and what is the most promising measure. So sometimes what happens is people will look and they'll say, oh, I found a measure, and that measures that particular concept. And that's not always the case. There are a lot of bad measures out there. So what you want to do is compare measures and to see which measure is the most appropriate for your concept of interest. So a lot of you are going to be doing research associated with maybe social media, such as YouTube. And in that case, you got to think about what concepts can be studied within that particular space. So how do we create a concept or identify a concept? What makes a concept a concept? So we are interested in social science concepts, and the things that are required for a quality concept is, first of all, abstractness. So you don't want a concept that can be tied to one place and one time. Otherwise, it serves no utility in predicting and explaining human behavior. So one key attribute of a good concept is something that we can study over a period of time. So people who study a particular point in history, you really can't develop concepts related to that period. And I'm not a big fan of concepts such as Facebook use because that's limited to one medium, and who knows, over time whether platforms such as Facebook or such as YouTube will still sustain. And so if we're really trying to serve the scientific community, we want to develop concepts that will serve them over decades, many, many, many years. The next thing is we want to make sure that it's empirically relevant, or it's also called operationalizable. And what that means is that if we see things like I mentioned depression, I have to figure out ways to measure that. But I have to argue it can be measured. Otherwise, we can't conduct future research on that. So in more qualitative research, the whole focus is oftentimes about developing a concept and labeling a concept, where in quantitative research, it's more about taking that concept and seeing which other concepts it relates to. So it's more about testing the relationship of that concept to other concepts, where qualitative is more about developing that concept. So both are very challenging, but both focus on concepts. In quantitative, it focuses on taking numbers and applying them to that concept, where qualitative, it's first about describing that and developing items to measure that concept. And then the other one it's called intersubjectivity. So essentially what it is when you write or when you research a topic, the whole point is you're serving science and you're serving the scientific community. And it really is a community. So if you ever want to publish research for that community, you have to know how they describe that concept. So there's controversy as far as, should we use the term engagement, or is it just simply the word interactivity? So engagement became very popular as a kind of this new fancy term that people wanted to say that they studied was engagement. But then other scholars actually argued that it was just simply interactivity, which was studied, several years back. So you just had to figure out, first of all, what the community labels that concept and how they agree upon measuring that concept. Then that's the only way you can argue that it should be either built upon or it should be modified and changed in some sort of way. So this is just giving you a tip. When you start going through Google Scholar or other search engines, what you want to do is type in concepts, because that's how we see the world. And when you write your literature review, it hangs on concepts. And you're basically arguing that one concept predicts variations in another concept. Okay, so it's really kind of cool. What you're doing is just kind of trying to map chaos and map the world and make sense of all this very abstract stuff that happens out there. So here's some examples of concepts: interactivity, engagement, loyalty, brand loyalty, store loyalty, social presence. So do I feel like there's some sort of presence of some being there? EWOM, it's electronic word of mouth, is popular, I believe, in marketing. Apprehension, and there are different types of apprehension. Perhaps communication apprehension, tolerance, efficacy, public deliberation. So you can see these are all words, trust, that are used, but we have to figure out how to measure them. And so you have to figure out which concepts represent your study, and that's what I'll be looking for. I don't want you to talk just to a great extent about the topic in general, but I want you to explore the concepts, defend why the concepts are important, and why you expect that this concept is going to predict variations in another concept. Okay, so what does this look like if I was to map it out visually? And I'm a big visual person. So we have kind of various levels of abstraction, but we have to take the very abstract and try to measure it with observables, so directly observables. So this is a very simple illustration, but here we have television viewing. So we say, okay, do you watch television? Like, what do you mean by do I watch television? So some people might be interested, to what extent do you watch entertainment television? And then to what extent do you watch television news? And then you could even get down a little bit more precise or more observable. Do you watch national news, local news, morning news? Because we know that each one of those has a different type of audience. So you might want to specify what type of news you're interested in. And so you can see here we have the concept, then we have the dimensions of the concept. And so you will find, and I'll talk about dimensions next week, but what you'll find is that many concepts have dimensions that represent them. And then you have kind of measures. To what extent do you watch national news? To what extent do you watch local news? Same thing goes with political participation. So we say political participation is an important concept. We need to study that concept. And now we got to figure out, how do we interpret that concept? So we have participation, high cost, low cost, voting versus actually going out and getting people to sign a petition are two different types of political participation. And so it's important then to detail that. And so I just kind of want to highlight, okay, we have these concepts and then there's these sub-concepts that represent that. But clarity is key, and we need to have clarity because really when you're reading research, what it is that scientists are essentially communicating to one another, building on one another's work in hopes of really building a very strong knowledge base. And one scholar can't do it by him or herself. We need a community of scholars working together to make that happen. So you want to first, when you pick out your topic, so first you pick your topic, and then what you want to do is just start listing the concepts associated with that topic. But remember that there might be different labels in relation to that concept. So you just have to first figure out how the scientific community labels what you think you're interested in. So here's some examples and variations in labels. So you would want to kind of search all of those various labels and figure out the label that the majority of the scientific community uses. One of the things that I've been interested in is journalistic roles, but in other roles literature, so what are the various roles within organizations? So roles could be, I believe that the function of journalists is to disseminate information or to challenge the status quo or to interpret complex events. But then if you look at roles literature, there's actually a line of roles literature in public relations. There's a line of roles literature actually in educational literature, but they refer to it more as functions rather than roles. So you just got to kind of figure out, first of all, when they're using this label, do they mean the same thing? And just kind of figure that out. It can be somewhat complicated, but so what I want to just try to say is, first of all, try to figure out what the concepts are related to your topic, and then start reading literature about those concepts. So consensus. Yeah, so consensus essentially is you want to first see what the consensus is regarding the names of the concepts, the attributes of the concepts, and the functions of the concepts. So let's say, okay, there's a chair. So we all, as a group of humans, decided that a chair is a chair. And then we decided that most chairs have 4 legs, so that's its attributes. Now, a chair could serve multiple purposes, but in society we mostly agree that a chair should be something that you sit on versus a table to eat at or a stool to stand on. It serves many functions, but in society we've kind of come together and said a chair is something that you sit on. So then the next thing, okay, you say, okay, you found your concepts that represent your topic. You figured out what labels the scholarly community uses to describe that topic. And then you got to figure out, how do they measure that concept? So what you do is you go into the methods section, usually under measures or operational definitions, and look to see how they measure that particular concept. You do not create your own measures, especially at this stage, unless you have more advanced training. What you should do is you need to first, whether you're creating your own measure or not, is use existing measures out there. You don't make them up for a survey. You don't do that. You need to go to the literature, find validated measures, measures that have been proven to be reliable, and use those measures to describe your concept. And I'll get into measurement more next week, but really critical, do not create your own measures. So operationalization, which is basically how you measure your concept, can be simple. So it could be someone's gender, someone's age. Those really aren't that challenging to measure. But once you find these very much, which we tend to focus on in science, is more complex concepts. So how do you measure something like prejudice or racism or happiness? You know, you could imagine that that's quite controversial. So if you're looking to measure something like that, you need to go to other scholars' work to see how they have interpreted it at an empirical level. So you can develop an operational definition, or you can use somebody else's word for word, or you can modify somebody else's. But if you never only take, so let's say that someone has a 10-item measure or scale to measure depression. You don't eliminate 3 of them because you don't like them. You have to use the whole 10-item scale. And if you modify the wording in any way, or if you delete any items, you have to make a justification as to why you did that. Most often, that is not, and especially well-established measures, you can't do that sort of thing. So what you want to do is just, first of all, figure out how it's been measured. And what you'll find, whether it's a survey method or a content analysis method, that it's measured differently, okay? And if you're in a qualitative research stage, what you're trying to do is, first of all, figure out how people define that concept and identify potential items that could be used for future researchers. So that's one of the issues I have with qualitative and quantitative research, is that there's not a qualitative-quantitative bridge. So ideally what would happen is qualitative researchers would suggest items that quantitative researchers could use to test whether they empirically represent a concept. But I'm going in a whole different direction there. Sorry about that. Okay. And what you'll find is that if you want to read research, what you're essentially doing in research, you're writing your client reports, your manuscripts in social science research. But what you find is that you're learning a whole new language. And so that's why people struggle. So if you've ever used, let's say, okay, if you've ever used Twitter, and what happened with Twitter is that it was a whole new language to learn in order to actually be able to use Twitter effectively. And so a lot of people did not use Twitter for that particular reason. The same thing goes with research. A lot of times it's too hard to even learn the language in order to even participate in the culture. So what we have is a concept, a social science concept, can be referred to, depending on levels of abstraction, as a construct, a concept, a variable. So just know that a variable, a good concept you have to be able to measure a concept. And it's because you want to have some variation. The idea is that variations in one variable will lead to variations in another variable. So let's say that taking research methods classes would ideally positively relate to your research efficacy, so your confidence in your ability to do research. And in this case, we have females read more magazines than males do. So essentially what we're saying is that there's 2 concepts in that particular statement. One is sex or gender, and then the other concept is magazine reading. So it might not seem that clear, but what we're essentially saying is that females read more magazines than males do, and their concepts are gender and magazine reading. But what you'll find is that it varies in some sort of way. Okay, so if I was to map give you a visual about what social scientists do, this is what we do at a qualitative or quantitative level. So the qualitative level, what we do is we first identify concepts, label those concepts, figure out what we mean by those concepts, and then ideally what we do is we see if those concepts have any predictive utility in our world. So ideally, we could figure out how perhaps participation in a class participation relates to research efficacy. So ideally, that would be a positive correlation. So what we do is we express ourselves in concepts. And then what the quantitative scholars do is they figure out a way to measure those concepts. So you can kind of see this marriage of the two particular methods in the most ideal world. So this visual is a very beautiful representation, a simple representation of what it is that we do. Now, if I was to give examples of that, what I would do is, okay, so for a long time there was a lot of research about TV violence and exposure to violence on TV. So first we had to define what was meant by violence in TV. Is swearing violence? Is screaming violence? Or does it have to involve actual physical violence? So we have to figure out what we mean by television violence, because there was a concern in our society for a long time about television violence. The assumption, of course, was that children who watch this violence on TV would be more aggressive. And so then we have to identify what is meant by aggressiveness and aggressive behavior. So then so now we've kind of come at a point where we're defining exposure. So what is exposure? How long must I watch television in order to be considered exposed to it? And I think the definition that these scholars came up with is like 4 hours or something like that. Okay, so then we have to identify the various types of television shows. And then you can see, then we looked at, okay, there's physical types of aggressive acts that a child could do, and then there's also verbal abuse, and then we can measure both of those. And then we get into the lowest indicators, which is really the measurement part, about how do we measure that stuff. So that's what we do. That's how we express ourselves in research, is through concepts from a very abstract to a very concrete level. And essentially all that we're doing is defending the definition of those concepts and defending that the one relates to the other. I'm defending, in this line of research, what they were looking at. Does television violence truly relate to aggressive behavior? We had to see whether that assumption about television violence was true. Okay, so that's all I have for this particular lecture on concepts. We're going to talk more about measurement and other types of research in the future. So thanks for listening.